welcome back to the wonderful world of VR, where the only things you can see are your hands and the only hitbox that matters is your head. Today we are going to take a look at Resident Evil 4 VR, and if you're wondering why I put two big black bars on the sides of the screen, well, that's just the way the Oculus Quest 2 official casting works. That's right, Resident Evil 4 is Quest 2 exclusive. No, not an Oculus Store exclusive, a Quest 2 exclusive, meaning the only way to purchase it and play it is on the standalone Quest 2 headset. Even if you have a PC to plug it into, there's no way to play on it. It's standalone or nothing, baby, for better or for worse. So, from the get-go, you can probably guess this is a giant stunt from Facebook to just get more people to buy their damn headsets, which, considering how cheap they are, you'd imagine they would already be selling pretty well, but they want to sell it even more, so they bought the rights to port it to Oculus from Capcom and gave the actual job of development to a company called Armature, and so how did they fare at it? Well, it's not too shabby. But before we head into that, first, a quick recap to the uninitiated. That's how it's called, the uninitiated, the people who didn't play the original game. Resident Evil 4 follows the adventures of Leon S. Kennedy, a US special agent, or, well, a police officer who got promoted to super secret spy after a zombie outbreak, who is tasked with rescuing Ashley Graham, the daughter of the President of the United States, after she got kidnapped. The clues point him to a small Spanish village that he soon finds out is overrun with violent people infected by a parasite known only as the Plaga. He also soon finds out that the Plaga is different from the usual zombie he is used to. They can still speak, and they have very low intellect, but they still have enough intellect to warn others of his presence, and to use tools and weapons, and to follow orders, which makes them much more formidable. Now, he'll have to use all of his wits and skills if he wants to figure out what's going on, rescue the president's daughter, and probably most important of all, get out alive. It's a basic premise that gets the job done, even if in true lazy VR port tradition, you get to watch all of the original game's cutscenes on a small window while surrounded by pitch black before you get actually back into the actual action where you play as Leon. Not even the radio transmissions survived intact, as whenever you get called, you get teleported into the cutscene dimension, where the majority of the environment turns into darkness with only what's nearby highlighted in white, and everything is frozen in time until you finish listening to the current call. These aren't your only interruptions though. Whenever an enemy grabs you, you enter the same black void while you must shake your controllers to escape, and when you kick open a door or push an object, you instead switch to a third-person view of Leon while he kicks open the door or pushes down the object for some reason. I don't know why they chose to do some like this and orders like that. I know it was a compromise that had to be reached to port the game into VR, but it highlights my main issue with this game, and that is that it tried to be too faithful to the original game. I know, that's blasphemy, right? Especially for someone like me who thought the original Resident Evil remake, which tried to be as faithful as possible to the original game, as quite possibly the greatest remake of all time. But here's the thing though, Resident Evil was a flat screen game being remade for another console that was also flat screen, and it was played with what was practically an identical controller. Resident Evil 4 VR is a port, not even a remake, just a straight up port from platforms that are fundamentally incompatible to the very core. Because of that, I felt like changes were in order in certain aspects, but changes were apparently not in order because they kept the same village with the same layouts and the same enemy count and the same everything. But ultimately, they couldn't keep the exact same gameplay mechanics because Resident Evil 4 is at its core a third-person shooter. So whenever Leon has to execute an action that requires a lot of physical exertion or can't be tracked by a Quest 2, remember it's just a headset and hand controllers, it can't track your feet. So when he tries to do something like a roundhouse kick or jumping out of a window, that has to be an immersion breaking cutscene, and Resident Evil 4 deserves better. Half-Life Alyx already exists as a proof that modern game design probably shouldn't be applied one-to-one on a VR game. You need to build the entire experience from the ground up for VR to truly make a masterpiece in VR. Valve could have just ported Half-Life 2 to VR after all, but instead they decided to make a whole new game so they could tweak and make new rules as much as they wanted, and those rules didn't just include surface level cool mechanics like keeping the UI and inventory on the gloves for maximum immersion. They also accounted for that in level design and how the player would interact with it. They account for that by drastically lowering the enemy count from a traditional Half-Life game, since each individual enemy would be much harder to aim at and to kill by a real human doing real human movement instead of aiming with a mouse. All of that stuff, the hard to notice details under the hood. That is what make the best VR experiences what they are, and that is why titles like Alyx and Boneworks are spoken with reverence in VR communities. Resident Evil 4 VR abandons its shot at reaching this sort of status from the get-go. By focusing on trying to be as faithful of a port as possible, rather than fine-tuning its experience for VR and or introducing new elements in a shot to push the medium forward, the focus of the developers stops being how do we make this as revolutionary as Resident Evil 4 was when it was released, and starts being how do we get to keep this experience as close as possible to the original. How many pieces of the puzzle can we fit into this board, even though in the end we know we will never be able to fit all of them neatly because of the fundamental incompatibility between the original hardware and VR hardware. It's a game you play knowing the odds are stacked against you, trying to reach 100%, giving 100%, giving your best to try to reach 100%, but knowing from the get-go that the best you can get is 75%, and in that sense, that's kind of a tragedy. And what really gets me thinking is that they already achieved part of what they wanted with the puzzles. All of the puzzles in the game world are actual physical objects that you can interact with instead of just throwing you into a void screen and asking you to choose from individual options like you'd expect from if they wanted to port them like they were in the original game. Instead, they are fully interactable. The typewriter is fully interactable, for fuck's sake, and it is awesome. So why can't we push things and roundhouse kick in first person? Did they think that it would be too disorienting if the player ended up in a different position from where they started? Well, then that would be hypocritical, since whenever you push something in third person, you do end up in a completely different position when you go back into first person. Did basic scenes like the merchant showing outside of a window really needed to be separate cutscenes? And couldn't they just be made in-game? Why didn't they make the cutscenes in first person? Were they afraid of people feeling bad because of the smooth locomotion? Couldn't have they just added tunneling options? Which, by the way, this game already has, along with every single comfort option possible in VR. It's great and it really deserves praise for that, but I feel like there had to be a better way of porting this game than it is right now. But yeah, my final opinion on that front is that RE for VR is a port, when fundamentally it should have been a remake, and that's a damn shame. But enough on the negativity front. I bet by this point you're wondering just how the damn game plays, and let me tell you, it actually plays fan-fucking-tastically. When you're in full control of Leon and not in the middle of any immersion-breaking shenanigans, the game plays like a dream. You get two different control schemes. One, where you are always holding a weapon and you can change that quickly with a weapon wheel, and an immersive mode, where your arsenal is always floating in front of you, more like, you know, on where your chest would be and over your shoulders, and you have to manually pick them up to use them. I personally went for the immersive mode since that felt a lot more intuitive. From there, you get the basics of hold the trigger to shoot, and you manually reload your weapons by loading in the magazines or shells that, you know, other VR games do. Though in a fun twist, you actually have to spray your first aid spray directly into your face to use it. And the way to activate grenades is that you actually have to pull the pin on them. Also be careful, since you can accidentally pull the pin while you're still wearing the grenade, and that's a very bad thing in case you couldn't tell. Again, nothing revolutionary that other VR games haven't done, but it's all done very well here. Shooting is a lot more intuitive and easier than in the original game, since now you can just point at the thing you want to shoot instead of fiddling with the analog stick. I missed a lot less here than during my previous playthrough of Resident Evil 4, simply because I managed to aim a lot more precisely with the Oculus controllers. Hell, in this playthrough alone, I shot more axes and dynamite from midair than I ever did before. It's just that good. Thanks to the high resolution, or well, at least high compared to my usual 1080p, and the first person view really putting you in the environment, I also managed to easily see when there were crows, treasure, or other shootable things spread around me, and I was also able to easily see the traps spread around as well. Also making things easier is that since you can now see more easily and farther, you can also easily engage enemies at really long distances, being able to pick off single enemies or small groups before they are even able to scratch you. The gondola segment is particularly laughable this time around since you can easily dispatch every single enemy with a single pistol shot before you get into throwing range, though whether that's a good difference or a bad difference, it's up to you. I do feel like these advantages serve to make for a good, if not completely precise, balance patch considering the enemy count and AI remains unchanged, even though it is much easier to get caught off guard in VR. Oh, and the knife, though it is not a gun, also greatly benefits from precision. No longer do you need to awkwardly stop in front of something and get Leon to take out the knife so he can stab something, a box or an enemy. No, you can just grab the knife and stab the thing. Because of that, breaking boxes is just incredibly intuitive and just fast flowing, and snakes that are either inside the boxes or even floating on lakes are easily dispatched without a single shot. The precision you can get from the knife in VR is insane, it's just great. Everything just flows better in VR, I guess. The game doesn't have the same ambience it did outside of VR though. The lighting was changed, sometimes completely removed, and the water effects have been downgraded. Not sure why each decision was made, maybe it was an artistic choice because they thought it just wouldn't look as good in VR, maybe some were concessions so the game could run on a standalone Oculus Quest 2, which, let's be honest, has the processing power of a potato. The point is, graphically, it isn't a one-to-one recreation. Don't let that make you feel sad about not being able to visit your favorite locations in VR though, because even though the ambience is slightly worse, it still is super fun to see your favorite places in VR. The castle in particular, which might be one of the most iconic and simply one of the best locations in all of gaming, and I don't mean that just visually, it's just a fun place to play around with. Looks spectacular in VR. Look, I know the footage I managed to take looks like shit, but just trust me on this one, okay? The castle is great, and the absolutely ridiculous set pieces like the enemies riding on top of those flaming towers on top of lava, they're even more funny looking in VR. But so yeah, the over-the-topness is just great, especially when you're not thrown out of it into the void theater, but unfortunately we just gotta take what we can get from this. The UI is, of course, mostly about interacting with physical objects in the real world, quote-unquote, with a few details like keeping your health bar and ammo on your wrist, but there's actually a few neat touches the developer added to make it so that you don't have to stare at your wrist every time you want to check your current status. Firstly, the amount of ammo that you have left is written on top of the ammo box where you get the ammo to reload, so every time you pull out some ammo, you will immediately know exactly where you stand on that front. And secondly, whenever you get damage enough to go down a, shall we say, health level from green to yellow and from yellow to red, you get the classic heart rate monitor style Resident Evil health bar to flash on the screen to warn you of your current level of danger. It even shows up as green when you fully heal, which is just a great feeling. It's these kind of details and the fully modeled puzzles that I wish the game had more of, especially since the wrist monitor is actually so small it's pretty much useless. The UI also changed on your inventory. This time when you open it, you get a giant interface to play with. There you can change your currently equipped weapons, recovery items, as well as your grenade type, but most importantly, you can play inventory Tetris. Ah yes! I feel like recent Resident Evil games have really slacked off on the inventory side of things, allowing you to end up carrying pretty much everything you find and thus making them sort of useless to even have a limited inventory. If there is one thing I'm glad they kept intact, it's definitely inventory Tetris. And they even managed to streamline it for VR by allowing you to rotate objects by simply rotating them with your hands like you would do in real life, and mix them up by just putting one object on top of another. It's very intuitive. The only complaint I have is that I have to use the items I equipped in real time, so I can't just enter the screen and use a health item then back off. No, I need to equip a health item, exit the screen, then use it. And if you have a lot of the same item, then that's okay since you can just keep picking them up, but it's severely annoying when you have 3 or more different types of healing mixes. since you need to set them up, each one of them individually, every time you use, you can just pull the next sort of healing item. You just need to keep entering and exiting the menu constantly. Of course, you had to do that in the original game as well, but there you would just enter the menu and use the item. Here, you have to enter the menu, manually equip the item by dragging it to the slot, exiting, grabbing from over your left shoulder and holding down a button and waiting for it to be used. I don't know if they did this for balancing reasons, but the number of extra steps necessary to make the decision makes it really annoying. Especially in VR, where the focus on immersion is greater and the less menu fiddling you do, the better. Treasures you can collect also return, and they get their own fancy collector looking shelf. They can be combined just like in the original game, and of course they can be traded in at the merchant, who gets his own little cutscene realm where you get to interact with him. It's kind of a shame just how much use the developers got out of the cutscene realm. It makes things feel really detached, but I'll forgive them. This time I'll forgive them if only because interacting with the merchant is just as intuitive and fun as interacting with the normal inventory. Bonus points for having to physically place your weapons in a real workbench in order to tune them up. The only thing better would be if the merchant only sold us the pieces and we had to manually tune the gun, then that would have been the dream, but alas, it's good enough. When it comes to the other aspects though, it's kind of hard to discuss them because they're pretty much the same. The music is still the same, with the beautiful typewriter theme returning just as you want it to. The story is still the same beat by beat, and the difficulty and the gameplay, well, they're just as you remember them. And Ashley is here too. I didn't even talk about her. Were her proportions always like this? I don't know. Is her head too tiny? Am I freaking out? She looks kind of weird. And I think the developers said, or reviewers said, I'm not sure, someone said that her AI was improved, but honestly, I never really saw Ashley as much of a bother in the original game. If you knew when she had to follow you and when she had to wait and hide, then it was easy as hell to get her to do what you wanted her to do. I don't know if maybe they updated her in the PC HD re-release, which is like my favorite version of the game. Maybe she already had better AI there, but yeah, she's here. She's kind of just there, just like in the original game. I guess she does some cool things, she helps you sometimes. But you know, honestly, at this point, I don't want to take too much out of your time by retreading these same points that 1,000 other critics already have, and they probably did in better ways too. So instead, it's time for us to take a very harsh turn and talk about a very unpleasant subject. Yes, I know some reviews just shove this under the rug, others didn't mention it at all, people aren't making a big case of it, or in some places or in others they are, but I'm not like that. I'm going to go into this head first. I'm going to jump into the spool of controversy. So if that tires you out, if you don't want to hear about that, if you just don't care, then that was the review you needed to listen. That was all you needed to know in order to make a purchase. If you want to make a purchase or wait for a sale or whatever, that was all the information. So, are you comfortable with this? If you are, keep listening, because unfortunately, probably against my own interests, I'm going to talk about... So, we now get to talk about censorship. Yay, the internet's favorite topic that I'm sure everybody is okay with and will not be controversial at all. Okay, first and foremost, let's get the semantics of the word censorship out of the way. If you believe censorship can only be done by the government, that's absolutely fine. I'm not here to dissuade you from that notion, but ultimately that's a sorely semantic point, meaning it doesn't matter if you want to call it censorship or if you want to call it editing, removing, remixing, whatever. The word doesn't matter. The thing we are here to discuss right now is the topic of the removal of certain lines of dialogue from the game. Facebook, I think Facebook, I'm going to say it's Facebook, it could have been Armature, but anyway, Facebook elected to do some harsh cuts to some of the dialogue from the game. Namely, anytime Leon flirts with Hannigan, a joke about there being no sex discrimination on the village when Leon finds a female corpse, but most important of all, the ballistics line. They removed the ballistics line. Shocking, I know. But let's back off a little bit first to explain how the dialogue cuts were made. The dialogue is completely unchanged aside from these edits. It's the same acting with the same voice actors from the original game, probably the same voice files, meaning the game jump cuts through the dialogue or uses blatant white noise to mask it. It's amateurish and very badly done. It's to the point that I think anyone paying close attention to the story instead of just looking forward to killing more Plagas is definitely gonna notice something feels wrong about the dialogue. Especially with the ballistics line, since now that the entire dialogue is the same except for this one line, Ashley gets pissed off at Louis for apparently no reason, so instead of getting rightfully angry at his lack of decor while they are about to get straight up fucking murdered, she's just being kind of an ass to a guy who, as far as she knows, is just here to help. And by the way, that shocking I said before, it might sound like sarcasm since I have no acting skills or charisma at all, but it is shocking that they removed it, because it is a cheesy, harmless line and the man who speaks it is immediately frowned upon. The only thing of note about the line really is metatextual. It is so cheesy, it immediately earned a place among the ranks of one of the best remembered lines in the entire Resident Evil franchise, right alongside Jill Sandwich. When I first played Resident Evil 4 on the PS2, yes, on the PS2, I didn't own a GameCube, I wasn't a cool guy, I didn't finish it. I only finished it a lot of time later, on the PC. So later, in fact, it was in April of this year. Yeah, that recently. So while I suffer from extremely poor memory, I still remember quite a few things about the game, and let me be honest with you when I say that I honestly don't remember a lot of Leon flirting with Hannigan out throughout the game before like the very last scene. It didn't like make that much of an impression on me, so I have to admit that if Facebook or Armature did a better job at it, I probably honestly wouldn't have noticed that. But I did because of how stilted and bland the dialogue Leon has with Hannigan is compared to how he interacts with literally every other character in the game. So yeah, good job there, Facebook. But they messed with the ballistics line? That line is, for better or for worse, kind of a sacred cow. Just look around the internet and you see a lot of people disappointed it didn't make it in. Enough of them, in fact, to have heated arguments with the people who don't care, or say they don't care. And trust me, if nobody really cared, these arguments wouldn't have existed in the first place. So yeah, people care about this line. And let me tell you, if you think that this line is too cheesy or you don't care, that is fine. If you want to buy this game and you think this won't affect your enjoyment of it at all, I 100% support you. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Just like I care about this ridiculous line from a video game that is honestly retro at this point. Yes, the PS2 is retro. Get your thing straight, you're old. You can just not care if you don't want to care. I can't force you to care. But if you say that this line is no big deal, if you think this line means nothing in the context of the larger Resident Evil franchise, then you are objectively wrong, and I can prove it. How? Just take a look at the achievement for rescuing Ashley in the PC HD release. See it? It's called Secure the Ballistics. This joke is so powerful that Capcom itself decided to add it to its re-release of the game. That happened, by the way, 9 fucking years after the original release of the game. This isn't some peak boomer cringe niche joke. This is big enough to endure and be referenced by the developers after all that time. That's how ingrained this is in the culture. You just can't erase it or take it back anymore. It's out there. Within the context of the game, in terms of length, the line is harmless and short and kind of a one-off joke. But the contribution this stupid line had to gaming culture at large is amazing, which is why it's so baffling it got removed. You can't just port Resident Evil 4 without some version of the ballistics line ending up on it. Just like you can't remake Resident Evil 1 without some version of Jill Sandwich. They changed that line, and the fact that they changed already puts them on the danger zone. If they completely remove that line, Resident Evil Remake would no longer be perfect. It's just like you can't remake San Andreas without some version of all you had to do was to follow the damn train, CJ, because you just can't. You can't remake Deadly Premonition without FK in the coffee. Okay, that one is remarkably more obscure among mainstream gaming, but it is true to its fandom. Some lines just evolve outside of the context of the original game and become just as, if not more, a part of culture than the games they came from. And you can't just poorly cut them out without some damn good justification. So yeah, the ballistics line is gaming history and should be preserved, and that is a certified game fact. Deal with it. And by the way, this isn't a show of support for the other cuts either. Sure, I didn't remember a lot of Leon flirting with Hannigan, but maybe for some people, even if it was for a minority of people, they thought of Leon as some sort of suave American James Bond flirting with his version of Moneypenny, a funny memory from the game they cherished. Yet now they jump right back into it to get their nostalgia fix, and then they realize that, oh, some of their favorite lines were cut. And that sucks. It honestly sucks, and I feel bad for these fictional people that I just made up in my head. And what sucks of this entire affair is that even if you don't care personally, there is nothing to gain from removing the enjoyment of these people. You aren't going to save the world or end sexism by removing a few lines from a game as cheesy and over the top as Resident Evil 4. Nobody is going into Resident Evil 4 looking for practical relationship advice, and if they are, then they have bigger problems than the game itself. Ultimately, if Facebook changed nothing, I guarantee there would be a lot less bad press than there is now. Like, no outlet is covering this negatively, but everybody's talking about it. Everyone wants to cover this change since Resident Evil 4 is just such a big part of gaming culture. And I personally know people who refused to pick the game up after they discovered it was censored. And I don't think keeping it in the game would affect sales at all. All they would get is maybe, and that's a big maybe, they would get some people in Twitter complaining about it and an article from Kotaku saying that they should have changed it, and nobody takes Kotaku seriously anymore. Of course, you could say the majority of people don't care or won't notice it before they already bought the game, so ultimately maybe these few sales they lost don't matter. Maybe they won't get many sales, but maybe they won't lose many sales either, and all of this is much ado about nothing. But does that mean that so long as the majority is happy that the minority doesn't matter? Does that mean that if 90% of the people who bought the game are happy with it, is it okay that 10% of them felt shortchanged by something minor that would have made their day a lot brighter if it was kept in as well, especially since it harms nobody? Because if that's okay, then it is okay when a majority bullies a minority for their benefit. It's all about utilitarianism after all. And if we maximize the happiness of 90%, then who gives a shit if 10% are exploited? And if you downtrodden and marginalized, it's okay. Because the apathy of the majority is what really matters. And you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Pokemon!
With the glass ceiling broken, all the oppressed groups shall prosper, especially the most oppressed group of all, gamers.
Remember the Bring Back National Dex controversy that happened recently when Pokemon Sword and Shield announced they wouldn't bring back all of the Pokemon from previous games? No, don't worry, I'm not just going on a random tangent, this is going to make sense. But the Pokemon company said that it would be okay since they would bring back everybody's favorite Pokemons, you know, they would just cut out the ones nobody cares about. Except that was a lie from the get-go, because it is literally impossible to do that without bringing back every Pokemon, because every Pokemon is somebody's favorite. This was a big point of the Bring Back National Dex campaign, which tried, unsuccessfully, to get Nintendo to back down from that decision. They brought people together to discuss which Pokemon were their favorites and why they were afraid they might end up just not making the cut. And that's the same thing that's happening here, at least in my weird perspective. For me, it's the ballistics line. To other people, it might be the honeygun flirting. To some, it might even be the actually pretty funny, let's not lie, sex discrimination joke. And to some, it might even be something that is in the VR release, like the right-hand joke. The thing is, everybody got their favorite joke, their favorite moment, their favorite character, their favorite twist about Resident Evil 4. And the best way to maximize everybody's enjoyment and to make sure everybody has a good time is to include as much of the original content as possible. If something wasn't possible in VR, then well, that's pretty sad, and we really need to come together and have a discussion about it, because I'm pretty sure if we work things together, maybe everything would have been possible in VR, you know? Maybe I just don't have the good ideas necessary to make a straight up port, but removing content that is perfectly fine and would have probably made somebody's day, especially in a port that advertises itself as faithful, well, that's just false advertisement. And that's no good. As a final note, before we sign off from this topic completely, I also want to say that this could have been handled a lot more gracefully if they just remained more of the game, like I said previously. If they removed Louis completely from the house segment and had Leon contact him about Ashley earlier or later through radio, assuming they gave him a radio, of course they also have to change that, and if they moved the house around so it happened maybe a little bit later, because let's face it, it's too iconic to not happen, but maybe also remix a little bit to keep it fresh for fans, then maybe they could have rebuilt the plot in a much more natural way so that the comment can't possibly happen, and then we would be having a much more pleasant conversation about if the elements they decided to remix improved the game or not, and things would have flown in a much more natural way than if they just decided to take the butcher's knife to remove whatever they thought dumbasses on Twitter think is offensive. Like I said, unlike a lot of parts, the problems with this one is that it simply changes too little. So the points that simply don't work as well in VR or that they removed just stick out a lot more. Oh, and they cut Ada's campaign in Mercenaries mode as well. Probably should have led with that instead of talking for 15 minutes about the dialogue cuts. But I am not a clever man. So, at the end of the day, it's time to consider who do I recommend this game for. I wouldn't recommend it for first time players because the void theater cutscenes and the constant cutting to third person makes the game flow really awkwardly for a first time playthrough. And I have a hard time recommending it to veterans of the original game, since just because you like the sluggishly controlled but frenetic combat encounters of the original game, and mastering those controls to breeze through the game like it was no problem, doesn't necessarily mean you will like the new VR controls and gameplay style. So I guess I will recommend this game for people who already have a VR headset that's gathering dust because they want something with a meaty campaign, which this game definitely does. And I will recommend it to Resident Evil fans who would just buy anything Resident Evil no matter how trash it is. Not saying the game is trash, it is great, but if you bought, say, Operation Raccoon City, then yeah, I don't see you being able to dislike these either. Well then, that's it for today, and since this is a quote-unquote horror game, you guys can consider this my Halloween video for the year as well. So yeah, class dismissed, go play outside or whatever it is you kids do these days.